Game theory is the only strategic shield that remains completely immune to the emotional manipulation of narcissistic minds. Imagine the following scenario. You are in a constant dynamic with someone, whether sharing the rent of an apartment in Chicago or dealing with that coworker in the corporate environment who always seems to have a perfect excuse not to do their part. You, being a reasonable person, try to cooperate. You give in a little here, cover a task there, assuming that eventually common sense will prevail and the favor will be returned. But weeks pass and you notice a disturbing pattern. The effort is always one-sided. When you finally decide to sit down to talk and try to resolve the situation amicably, something bizarre happens. The narrative is distorted, your words are turned against you, and suddenly, through sheer gaslighting, you are the one who ends up apologizing for bringing up the subject. What you are experiencing is not just a daily misunderstanding. It is systematic exploitation. And this is where most people a fatal mistake. Trying to fix a narcissist using empathy and emotional logic. Treating this type of person with the hope that they will magically develop a moral conscience is, in fact, a huge mathematical error. To survive and break this cycle of abuse, you need to take emotion out of the equation and look at the situation through a purely analytical lens. This is exactly what game theory is for. Game theory offers a logical and rational map to predict moves and neutralize the chaos these minds try to install in your life. But to ruthlessly apply game theory against someone who doesn't play fair, we first need to understand why the normal rules of society fail miserably when they enter the game. At the core of game theory, there is a very famous and widely studied thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. In simple terms, it is a situation where two parties would have a much better and more peaceful outcome if they just cooperated with each other, but each side has a strong selfish incentive to betray the other. If both cooperate, the result is positive for both. If one betrays and the other cooperates, the one who betrayed takes maximum advantage, and the other bears all the loss. If both betray, the destruction is mutual. The classic application of game theory dictates logic and reason should guide these choices to find a point of equilibrium. However, there is a critical flaw when trying to apply this traditional model in interactions with narcissistic and manipulative personalities. The big problem with classic game theory, and something that often frustrates those trying to be logical in daily life, is the premise that the parties involved are strictly rational agents. The model assumes that the parties want to practically maximize their gains and that deep down, they would prefer a scenario of peace and mutual cooperation, like keeping a clean apartment or advancing a corporate project without friction in Silicon Valley. But narcissistic minds do not operate with this common cooperative rationality. For these people, the interaction is not about achieving a win-win result and living in harmony. Through the lens of game theory, the dynamic with a narcissist mutates. It ceases to be a game focused on mutual benefit and becomes strictly a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, the math is cruel. For one player to win and feel pleasure, the other must necessarily lose. There is no option for a friendly tie. The satisfaction, ego, and sense of superiority of these personalities depend directly on the frustration, loss, or submission of others. They don't just want the problem solved or the task done. They want the power to force the other party to yield, while emerging unscathed and in control. Understanding this fundamental paradigm shift in game theory is the vital step to stop applying kindness where only cold math should operate. And it is exactly in this hostile zero-sum environment that the true face of manipulation reveals itself, demanding a drastic change in how the next decisions must be made on the board. Within game theory, human interactions are broadly divided into two main categories: cooperative games and non-cooperative games. In a cooperative game, the rules are clear, trust is mutual, and the goal is joint growth. Think of a healthy business partnership in New York, or a basketball team working together to win a national championship. However, when you deal with a manipulative mind, game theory shows us that reality changes shape quickly. The narcissist turns absolutely any interaction, no matter how simple and everyday it is, into a strictly non-cooperative game. To visualize this practically, game theory frequently analyzes the dynamics of extreme betting TV shows, where two participants sit face to face and must make a crucial blind decision: split the accumulated prize or steal it all for themselves. The rule is simple. If both choose to split, they share the money fairly. If one decides to split with good intentions, but the other chooses to steal, the one who stole takes everything, and the cooperative person goes home empty-handed. If both try to steal, they both lose everything. In a tense scenario like this, game theory introduces a powerful mathematical concept called dominant strategy, which is basically that choice that brings the best result for the player, regardless of what the opponent decides to do. And here is the central point to unmask manipulation. The narcissist's dominant strategy will always be the option to steal. In their psychological structure, cooperating is seen as a sign of weakness, an unacceptable loophole to be double-crossed. Therefore, they play on an aggressive defensive, always opting for veiled betrayal, blame-shifting, or unfair advantage. If you, guided by empathy and the hope of fixing the relationship, enter this game repeatedly choosing the option to split, game theory predicts exactly your mathematical fate. You will be systematically emptied, leaving the interaction exhausted, confused, and with absolutely nothing, while the manipulator takes the entire prize, whether moral, emotional, or psychological. Understanding this predatory dynamic leads us directly to analyze the two worst traps victims usually fall into when they try to react to this infinite cycle of betrayals. When people finally realize they are trapped in an endless cycle of manipulation and zero-sum games with a narcissist, game theory predicts they will react almost automatically and, unfortunately, incorrectly. There are basically two common behavioral traps, and both are guaranteed mathematical formulas for long-term failure. The first approach is what game theory would call unconditional submission, or the role of the eternal peacemaker. It is the person who desperately tries to keep the peace, absorbing all the blame and continuously forgiving betrayals and disrespect, hoping that the narcissist will someday recognize this sacrifice. The problem, mathematically speaking, is that the game theory model proves that limitless cooperation against an opponent who uses betrayal as a dominant strategy does not generate gratitude. It only generates more exploitation. The narcissist reads continuous forgiveness not as kindness, but as an open invitation to increase the level of disrespect without suffering consequences. The second extreme, which is equally disastrous, is total and unrestricted retaliation. You get tired of being a doormat and decide to clash head-on, going to war with the manipulator. You try to win arguments, prove they are wrong with logical facts, expose their lies, and strike back at every offense. In forums and comments about game theory, many people suggest aggressive revenge tactics. The problem with this approach is that you are playing the game where the narcissist is an expert. In game theory, a mutual escalation of continuous retaliations, where both sides constantly choose to betray and attack, inevitably leads to mutual destruction. You enter a state of mental and emotional exhaustion so deep that you start dedicating all your vital energy to a toxic person, while your own life stagnates. These two strategies, infinite submission and exhausting war, fail for opposite reasons. Game theory warns us that the ideal response is not becoming a passive victim nor matching the manipulator, but adopting a behavioral pattern that is strictly logical, calculated, and above all, emotionless. Game theory found its greatest and most famous behavioral solution in an extensive experiment in 1980, using computer simulations and dozens of experts from all over the world to discover what would be the best and most effective strategy to deal with repetitive interactions of conflict and cooperation. Amidst complex, aggressive, and treacherous computer programs, the strategy that consistently outperformed all others and won the tournaments repeatedly was the simplest and most direct of all. The strategy known in English as tit-for-tat, which can be translated as strict logic of reciprocity. The way this brilliant game theory tactic works, and how it becomes your absolute shield against a narcissistic mind, is based on 4 fundamental pillars of survival, free from any emotion. First, tit-for-tat is never the first to betray. It always starts any interaction in the real world by cooperating, ensuring you are never the original aggressor or create unnecessary problems. Second, and this is the critical point against a narcissist, retaliation must be immediate and proportional. As soon as the manipulator betrays trust, lies, disrespects a boundary, tries to gaslight, game theory dictates that you apply the punishment with an equivalent response in the next round of the game. No screaming, no dramatic long texts, no trying to explain your feelings. Just the cold consequence. You cut off access, remove the privilege, say a simple no or leave the room. Third, this game theory strategy requires tremendous clarity in communication. The narcissist needs to know exactly that their action generated your protective reaction. The unspoken message is, I am reasonable and kind, but every time you try to step all over me, you will be blocked. Finally, the 4th pillar is the ability to forgive without holding a grudge. If the narcissist, facing firm consequences, backs down and cooperates again, tit-for-tat immediately cooperates again in the next move, without dwelling on the past and without bringing up old fights. This completely destroys the dramatic supply they feed on. You become a relentless algorithm of boundaries. They can't make a doormat out of you because your retaliation is automatic, and at the same time, they cannot drag you into an exhausting cycle of long-term victimhood because you return to cooperating as soon as the threat ceases. You, in practice, regain control of your peace through the unshakable logic of game theory. However, game theory does not only deal with victories in singular battles. It also points to a masterful exit for situations where the narcissistic dynamic becomes unsustainable. Although game theory's tit-for-tat strategy is the most efficient shield for interactions with narcissistic minds that you cannot simply exclude from your life, such as coworkers, bosses, or close family members, there is a scenario where math pushes us toward an even more powerful decision. Game theory studies what happens when players find a state where neither of them benefits anymore by changing their strategy, as long as the other side maintains theirs. This state is known in mathematics and economics as the Nash Equilibrium, and when you apply the Nash Equilibrium to a deeply abusive relationship with a narcissist, the answer game theory gives us is brilliant and liberating. As we have seen throughout the theory, the narcissist has structured the game so that the rules are always rigged in their favor. They feed on your confusion, your anger when trying to fight back, or your submission when trying to appease. In forums and discussions about the practical application of game theory in toxic relationships, one of the most genius conclusions people reach is the following: the best solution for an impossible dilemma is to reject the premise of the dilemma. If the game is rigged so that you always leave emotionally drained, the ultimate move in game theory, and the true Nash equilibrium for your mental sanity, is simply to stop playing. In psychology and abuse survival strategies, this is perfectly translated by the gray rock method, or, in extreme cases, by zero contact. In practice, game theory teaches that by becoming uninteresting, monotonous, and by not offering any emotional reaction, whether positive or negative, you cut off the manipulator's vital supply. You become a gray wall, a useless variable on their chessboard, since they need conflict, drama, or adoration to exist in the zero-sum game. The lack of any return from you forces the narcissist to look for another player. By rejecting the game and seeking zero contact, you achieve the perfect Nash equilibrium. The manipulator gains nothing by trying to hit you, and you completely protect your energy and your time. It is the mathematical proof that true victory in game theory doesn't always mean defeating the opponent, but rather refusing to participate in the destruction. And this logical and relentless lesson leads us to the most important conclusion of our entire strategic journey. Ultimately, the great lesson of applying game theory to toxic relationships and narcissistic minds is not to turn you into someone cold, calculating, or incapable of loving. On the contrary, game theory serves as a logical shield to protect your kindness, your empathy, and your ability to genuinely cooperate, ensuring that these qualities are not drained by those who only seek to exploit others. As was brilliantly summarized in discussions on the topic, the best strategy to win in life is do no harm to anyone, but take no nonsense. Game theory teaches us to always start with good intentions, to offer trust, and to build bridges. But the millisecond the manipulation begins, the protection algorithm must be activated without guilt and without hesitation. Whether dealing with the roommate who never washes the dishes and gaslights when confronted, or with a corporate manipulator sucking your vital energy, the math is clear. Impose immediate boundaries, cut the emotional supply, refuse to play their twisted game, and if necessary, leave the table. If you liked this deep analysis of human behavior through the relentless logic of game theory, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so we can master the hidden rules of this board we call life together. Until the next move.